Good afternoon! The moment you've all been waiting for has finally arrived. Another episode of History in Minutes with me, Nicole. In today's episode, we will discuss the importance of the March on Washington in 1963, as well as A. Philip Randolph's involvement within the movement and the march itself. But before we start today's lesson, let us first reintroduce to our knowledge who A. Philip Randolph was. He was best known as the founder of Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and as the main leader of the March on Washington. Philip Randolph was an extraordinary leader and activist during a time of high social and economic racial discrimination. In addition to A. Philip Randolph, our other main focus for today's lesson will be the March on Washington. The march aimed to fight towards jobs and freedom for African Americans, which occurred 100 years after the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation. This march could also be viewed as a way to commemorate this past victory, while in the meantime also hoping for another one. Now that you're eager to learn more, let us finally delve into today's lesson. A. Philip Randolph began to make headway for himself as well as other civil rights leaders as he fought unapologetically loud and proud in order to be heard within a deaf society. He began approaching multiple presidents in order to gain support towards outlawing discriminative actions, while flooding the streets with protesters and uniting with leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. to execute the largest civil rights gathering in history, although that wasn't their initial goal. But prior to his groundbreaking activism, Randolph believed that implementing smaller yet significant protests and legislative actions would eventually result in racial equality. Once he realized that this approach deemed less effective than he first believed, due to the slow rate of change, in January 1941, Randolph planned a march on Washington, which was more so an open threat towards the president. Ultimately, this led to the passing of the Executive Order 8802, which was signed due to President Roosevelt's fear that the march would embarrass himself as well as the government. Although he had hoped his approach would implement progressive change within America, the legislative actions taken at this time, though successful initially, were not enough for a major societal change. This is when Randolph began to realize what his next move would then have to be. The execution of, you guessed it, the March on Washington. The civil rights movement as a whole unveils how racial inequality throughout history continuously held America back from socially and economically evolving. In the midst of societal imbalance, the March on Washington portrayed the recently evolved nationwide support towards racial equality. On August 28, 1963, the earthquake-like rambling indicated the arrival of over, wait for it, 200,000 protesters, all ready to walk the perimeter of the Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial. Chanting, marching, and protesting for equal rights for hours, ignoring the agony pain their bodies experiencing until they had the chance to rest. Finally, when they did, they sunk their throbbing feet into the cold water of the reflective pool while listening to Martin Luther King Jr.'s memorable I Have a Dream speech. Enthralled in his words, protesters would miss their buses home since a day filled with dreaming of a brighter future deemed far more important. Change was coming, and it still is. Leaders and activists like A. Philip Randolph brought forth a glimmer of hope to those that began to give up, for freedom felt like it was still centuries away. In hopes of abolishing discrimination and hostility towards those of a different race, Randolph fought the majority of his life for this to be reality, and not just a dream.